And I'm just starting the recording thing. So, formally, welcome to Seattle University. It is my honor to host a lot of colleagues from both inside the university and from across the globe. I know there are people from India who've logged on at 1 or 2 in the morning their time to be here. So I'm very grateful to them for their scholarly commitment and enthusiasm. My name is Nalini Iyer. I am a professor of English here at Seattle University. This talk, Rescripting Rape and the Victim Survivor in Maxine Hong Kingston, Bharti Mukherjee, and Patricia Chao, has been co-sponsored not only by the Pigott McCone Chair that I hold, but also the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program and the English department. So it's an honor for all three of our units to welcome a scholar like Robin on board today for this talk. For those who don't know her, Robin Field is a professor at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, professor of English. Her background is in American Lit, but has a deep background in ethnic literature as well as South Asian literature. I have worked with Robin in a variety of ways for the last several years. We've contributed to volumes, but most importantly, Robin's the managing editor for the South Asian Review, a journal that I have the privilege of editing, and my colleague Maurice Jayasuriya is also here, who's an associate editor for the journal. So it's a joy to have Robin here. Robin just published the book Writing the Survivor, the rape novel in late 20th century American fiction. And this novel, by the way, this book, by the way, is available electronically at Seattle U Library for those of you who are from this campus. I'm going to read the publisher's blurb for those of you who are interested in knowing more. Writing the Survivor, the rape novel in late 20th century American fiction, identifies a new genre of American fiction, the rape novel, that recenters narrative of sexual violence on the survivors of violence and abuse rather than the perpetrators. The rape novel arose during the women's liberation movement as women writers collectively challenged the traditional erasure of female subjectivity and agency found in earlier representations of sexual violence in American fiction. The rape novel not only foregrounds survivors and their stories in a textual centering that affirms their dignity and self-worth, but also develops new narratological strategies for portraying violent, disturbing subject matter. In bringing together many key women's texts of the last decades of the 20th century, the rape novel demonstrates the centrality of sexual assault to women's fiction in this era. The rape novels of the 21st century continue the political activism inherent in the genre, educating readers, offering community to survivors, encouraging social activism as the stories of male survivors are increasingly told. A radical reconsideration of late 20th century American novels, Writing the Survivor, underscores the importance of women's activism upon the novel's form and content and reveals the portrayal of rape as rape to be an interethnic imperative. This is a complex and difficult topic, and I am really glad that Robin has taken this on. And Robin, the floor is yours. So folks, we will have Robin speak, and then there'll be time to have our Q&A via chat, or depending on the number of people, just wave and I recognize you, something. We'll figure that out. So Robin, the floor is yours, or the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, Nalini. I am so delighted for your invitation to speak with you today about my new book, Writing the Survivor. And I have to hold it up, even though I know the picture for today's talk had the same photograph of me. It's just such a delight to hold it in my hands. So I'm so grateful to Nalini for issuing me the invitation to share my work with you all, and for everyone who is taking the time today to join us. I'd like to begin by discussing how American fiction published before 1970 did not portray rape as sexual violence, but instead as titillating and pornographic voyeurism. So Gone with the Wind offers perhaps the most well-known depiction of unrecognized marital rape in early 20th century American culture. This rape vanishes from the novel and the film, and from much of the American cultural memory of Gone with the Wind, to be replaced by the more prevalent cultural constructions of rape and sexual violence that permeated American sensibilities until the early 1970s. Let us recall the famous or infamous staircase scene where, after Rhett and Scarlett argue and Scarlett walks away from him, Rhett then follows her, scoops her up in his arms, and carries her upstairs to have sex with her, all while she is struggling and beating her fists against him. This scene, which you may know from the film, but is almost exactly the same in the novel itself, utilizes a plethora of myths that obfuscate the pain and terror of rape. Scarlett likes being overpowered by Rhett. All women secretly crave rape is a myth. Although she resists at first, Scarlett ultimately enjoys herself. If you're going to be raped, you might as well enjoy it, according to another myth. Or Rhett was overcome by his passion for his wife. Men cannot control their biological urge to have sex, a third myth. And Scarlett is not raped because Rhett is her husband. A husband cannot rape his wife, a fourth myth. The prominence of Gone with the Wind as a cultural artifact helped to inscribe an understanding of rape in the American psyche that was stripped of pain, fear, and degradation for the woman involved. In this scene, rape was simply rough sex, and rough sex was, in turn, posed as the height of eroticism. These understandings of rape appear throughout American literature in the mid-20th century, from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man to Norman Mailer's An American Dream. Mailer, for example, presents as normative the view that all women enjoy pain, degradation, and humiliation. As his novels were touted for their sexual freedom, their graphic representations of forced violent sex presume and indeed encourage voyeuristic enjoyment on part of readers. In 1970s Sexual Politics, Kate Millay convincingly describes how Mailer instead promotes a repressive gender politics. Because of its efficacy in functioning as a trope for contested social and cultural agendas, rape becomes sundered from its original signification of the violation of a human body. A new genre of American fiction also arose in 1970 to combat these twisted notions of rape and sexual violence. I call this new genre the rape novel. The rape novel arose in the wake of the women's liberation movement with the dual mandates of feminist activism and the literary recuperation of female experiences. Critics such as Sabine Silka and Pamela Barnett have argued convincingly that representations of rape in earlier American fiction foremost signify concerns about race, class, and nationality. Building upon this work, I demonstrate how African American, Asian American, Latinx, Native American, and Anglo-American women in the 1970s and early 80s collectively challenged the traditional troping of sexual violence that erased female subjectivity and agency. The rape novel not only foregrounds the victim and her story in a textual centering, which restores her dignity and self-worth, but it also develops new narratological strategies for portraying violent subject matter in a constructive and informative manner. In bringing together many of the key women's texts of the last decade of the 20th century, the rape novel demonstrates the centrality of sexual assault to women's fiction of this era. Ultimately, Writing the Survivor offers a radical reconsideration of the late 20th century American novel. First, by underscoring the importance of women's activism upon its form and content, and secondly, by offering the rape novel as evidence for the critical necessity of reading across ethnic literary traditions. So in early chapters of the book, I talk about some of the literary predecessors of the novels, which include memoirs and polemical nonfiction. But I'm going to jump straight into the 1970s to talk about the first rape novels, which struggled with the literary legacy of the rape trope and with the societal acceptance of rape myths. These texts acknowledge that rape indeed may signify issues of race, class, or nationality. However, they also demand that rape be understood as the violation of a woman's person. These novels portray rape as rape, allowing the reader to understand the violence enacted upon the victim's body, the brutality impressed upon her mind, and the devastating personal and communal repercussions of the act. Rape is no longer merely a signifier for various power struggles between men. Instead, it is returned to the province of those women who suffer the physical and psychological consequences. This recentering is achieved through the unflinchingly realistic portrayal of sexual violence on the page. Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior is a key example of demonstrating how the traditional readerly reaction of voyeuristic pleasure to depictions of rape, and I am happy to talk about this in the Q&A since I didn't have time to really flesh that out right now, how this voyeuristic pleasure is replaced by feelings of shock and horror, more appropriate for this subject matter. Because the first rape novels offer a new script for the rape story, one that focuses primarily on the victim, The Woman Warrior should be read as one of the first critically and commercially successful books to address rape with a sympathetic description of the victim. Kingston's inclusion of a story of rape in her book, which ostensibly is about female identity and cultural conflict, underscores the importance of sexual assault, not only to the victim, but also to her family and community. Kingston does several remarkable things in this novel. First, she breaks the silence that had occurred in fiction about the victim's perspective of rape by simply telling her aunt's story, and sympathetically at that. Second, she confronts the rape myths that her mother's version of the story contained, and in doing so, she expands her own vision of female autonomy and sexuality. Third, she demonstrates the possibilities for the representation of a traumatic sexual assault by recasting the story in several different lights. Finally, Kingston links herself to her aunt, demonstrating the connections between rape victims and other women. Ultimately, Kingston demonstrates the viability of writing the story of rape in fiction and highlights the many possibilities for creating this story. The first section of The Woman Warrior, entitled No Name Woman, contains the story of Kingston's aunt in China, whose name she does not even know. Her aunt's story is passed down from mother to daughter as a cautionary tale about illicit sexuality. Kingston begins the novel as follows. "You must not tell anyone," my mother said, "what I am about to tell you. In China, your father had a sister who killed herself. She jumped into the family well. We say that your father has all brothers because it is as if she had never been born." Kingston's mother, Brave Orchid, tells young Maxine how this aunt, no-name woman of the section's title, became pregnant long after her husband left the village to emigrate to the United States. In retaliation for the breaking of social taboos, the village people attacked the family's house on the night the baby was born, destroying and looting the property. No-name woman gave birth in the pigsty later that night and then jumped into the family well, taking the baby with her. Brave Orchid ends the story with, "Don't tell your father, don't let your father know that I told you. He denies her. Now that you have started to menstruate, what happened to her could happen to you. Don't humiliate us. You wouldn't like to be forgotten as if you had never been born. The villagers are watchful." Brave Orchid uses the story of No-Name Woman to stress the negative consequences of unsanctioned sexual activity to not only the woman involved, but also the family and community. Indeed, the previous quotation underscores the notion that sex is not private, but instead functions as a public experience that the community controls. The young Maxine absorbs the story of her aunt into her life, but not in the way Brave Orchid would have hoped. One of the primary themes of the novel is breaking silence, and Kingston immediately confronts this issue by making her aunt's taboo story the subject of the first section of The Woman Warrior. Kingston's initial presentation of the rape is linked directly to the notion that sexual assault has not been, and according to prior social norms, should not be portrayed sympathetically. The best way to enforce this dictum, of course, was to discourage the depiction of rape at all. Kingston acknowledges this maxim by immediately publicly acknowledging it and then refuting it in the first lines of the novel, where she says, "You must not tell anyone what I'm about to tell you." With these lines, the very silence that Brave Orchid and the larger community demands about rape is broken. Silence is a pervasive element in Brave Orchid's depiction of No-Name Woman's story. In Brave Orchid's version, No Name Woman is solely to blame for her pregnancy, for either she had engaged in consensual sex, which results in the pregnancy, or she allowed herself to be raped. In either case, silence is the only reaction from her family. No words are spoken about the circumstances surrounding this pregnancy, either to question No Name Woman or to defend her when the villagers come to destroy the family compound. Brave Orchid says, "No one said anything. We did not discuss it." No Name Woman too follows this pattern. She never reveals whether she had been an unwilling participant in the sex or the name of the child's father, who is quite possibly her rapist. Silence, it seems, was the only option for this Chinese woman. Kingston links her aunt to a larger group of contemporary women who remain silent about their violations, those who refuse to tell their stories or to link their names to those stories. In dubbing her aunt No Name Woman, Kingston personifies the anonymous rape victims in contemporary American society. Previous understandings of rape styled the victim as nameless and faceless, which erased her personality and individuality. This erasing allowed the act of rape to appear unconnected to an actual woman who would experience pain and terror, which in turn led rape to seem like an intangible concept rather than a bodily violation. Kingston emphasizes this separation of assault from real woman by naming her aunt No Name Woman. Yet in imagining her aunt's life, Kingston creates a personality for her, thus negating the notion that rape happens to non-existent or anonymous women. In highlighting the namelessness that had defined rape victims, Kingston reinforces the importance of associating a name with the experience of sexual assault. Kingston's narrator, Maxine, questions her mother's version of the No Name story, refusing to limit its significance to a personal warning about the dangers of sexual activity from a mother to a daughter. Instead, Maxine probes deeper into the possibilities of No Name Woman's life experience to deconstruct the gender roles that place sexual responsibility entirely onto the woman. Just a few paragraphs after Brave Orchid's final warning words to her daughter, Maxine suggests the possibility that No Name Woman's pregnancy was not the result of wanton sexual behavior, but quite possibly the outcome of a rape or series of rapes. She notes that, quote, "adultery is extravagance," unquote. And during wartime in 1920s China, when this story took place, it is unlikely that her aunt would begin an affair. She says, "My aunt could not have been the lone romantic who gave up everything for sex. Women in the old China did not choose. Some man had commanded her to lie with him and be his secret evil." Kingston's naming of rape in her novel is deeply significant, for she is breaking the silence in American fiction of the crime of rape and its traumatic repercussions and consequences for the victim, refusing to bow to the traditions of her family, who virtually erase No Name Woman from their family history, or society, who might prefer to deny the occurrence of rape by dubbing No Name Woman an adulteress instead. Kingston places her aunt as a central character in her text, whose story is worthy of telling. In this, the experiences of No Name Woman are validated instead of denied. The tradition of silence has been broken. In the very first chapter of the novel, Kingston forces her readers to consider the possibility of rape. And in telling this story, Kingston underscores the reasons for the absence of these stories in our literature, the tradition of silence. After breaking silence about rape, Kingston then privileges the point of view of the rape victim. Such focus on the victim's consciousness conveys this new voice with maximum impact. Maxine presents her aunt's viewpoint at the end of the following passage. "Perhaps she had encountered him in the fields or on the mountain where the daughters-in-law collected fuel, or perhaps he first noticed her in the marketplace. He was not a stranger because the village housed no strangers. She had to have dealings with him other than sex. Perhaps he worked in an adjoining field, or he sold her the cloth for the dress she sewed and wore. His demand must have surprised, then terrified her. She obeyed him. She always did as she was told." Kingston does not portray No Name's woman in a first-person perspective, the point of view that many subsequent rape novels utilize. However, No Name Woman focalizes the narrative in order to allow readers to reflect upon her reaction to the rape, which effectively conveys the psychic trauma that rape victims experience. In addition, Maxine's narration of this scene demonstrates an appropriate reaction to rape from a third party, sympathetic and supportive. This reaction also underscores the importance of the community, of a supportive community for the rape victim. Maxine's narration creates such a community, in contrast to the complete dearth of sympathy that Brave Orchid narrates from the family and community. Maxine even goes beyond the simply forming of a supportive community as she links her own life directly to the rape victim. Maxine is compelled to narrate her aunt's trauma. She personifies the notion of bearing witness by first internalizing her aunt's story and then presenting it to the larger world. Kingston underscores the traumatic nature of rape and deconstructs rape myths by bluntly describing the specifics of the rape scene. Her narrator hypothesizes about who the rapist could be, for in the small community of the village, the rapist was not a stranger. Kingston then emphasizes the powerlessness that No Name Woman may have experienced as she lived through the rape. Another passage begins with the possible words of the rapist, the only time his voice appears in the text. If you tell your family, I'll kill you, I'll beat you, I'll kill you. Be here again next week. No one talked sex, ever. And she might have separated the rapes from the rest of living, if only she did not have to buy her oil from him or gather wood in the same forest. I want her fear to have lasted only as long as rape lasted, so that the fear could have been contained. No drawn out fear. Kingston demonstrates that rape can be a recurring traumatic event, not something a woman subconsciously or consciously craves. The perspectives of No Name Woman and Maxine reveal that rape strips the victim of power and agency, that she does not have a choice about it, and that the effects of rape are long-lasting. For No Name Woman, rape means death and dishonor for her and her child. The punishment for her supposed transgression continues even after her death, in the silence her family maintains about her very existence. Yet despite the strong conditioning by her family to deliberately ignore her aunt's memory, Maxine changes her mind. By telling her aunt's story to the world, she refuses to participate in her family's punishment. And significantly, by looking beyond the mere fact of the transgression of extramarital sexual activity, she offers other explanations for her aunt's pregnancy. These other explanations appear in the novel as multiple narratives for No Name Woman's story. Maxine ponders the many possibilities for the pregnancy. Her aunt fell in love with a man. She wantonly took many lovers, any of whom could have fathered the child. She was raped by a fellow villager, a man who probably took part in the raid on her family's house. Or she was raped by a family member. Maxine finds these last two alternatives most probable. But the lack of narrative closure inherent in these multiple narrations demonstrates the new discursive space made possible by the anti-rape movement. No longer are rape victims limited by the simplistic and reductive understandings of sexual assault that leave them responsible for their assaults. Instead, their stories contain the complexity and depth of trauma that accompanies the emotional and physical repercussions of rape. The conclusion of this introductory chapter of The Woman Warrior underscores a final important point. Rape victims and their experiences are important and comprehensible to all women, regardless of one's own experience or lack thereof with rape. From the first, Maxine finds her aunt's story connected to her own life, despite never having met her. Through her tragic story, No Name Woman teaches Maxine lessons about sexuality, female identity, and personal autonomy. Foremost, her aunt's story teaches her to question other people's versions of events. Brave Orchid's rendition assumes the aunt must have taken a lover and was responsible for her own death. The villagers too make this assumption as they come to loot and pillage her family's home. The injustice of her aunt's treatment inspires Maxine to create other narratives to explain her aunt's experiences. She wants to imagine the possibilities that No Name Woman was denied in Brave Orchid's version of the story. She sifts through her mother's story to uncover pieces that might be interpreted in new ways, to allow her aunt a different life. Maxine honors the malleability of interpretation when she imagines many different versions of her aunt's life. There is so much more to say about the woman warrior, but I'll move on here to briefly discuss two novels from the 1980s and 1990s, Bharti Mukherjee's Jasmine and Patricia Chao's Monkey King. The central prerogative of rape fiction in the 1980s is to underscore the legitimacy of the traumatic experience by providing in-depth accounts of the assault and its physical and psychological repercussions. Novels such as Alice Walker's The Color Purple, Sandra Cisneros's The House on Mango Street, and Jasmine all contain harrowing rape scenes that use their detail to emphasize the fact that rape engenders deep psychological consequences. Drawing upon Judith Herman's influential work, Trauma and Recovery, I mapped the depth of emotional damage incurred from sexual violation that is delineated in these texts. Far from glamorizing sexual violence, these novels present an alternative narrative that educates the uninformed reader and provides affirmation to those survivors seeking an empathetic community. That these texts bridge ethnic literary traditions testifies to the vital importance of rape fiction as a genre to create a literary memorial for all victims of sexual assault. Let's look closely at Bharti Mukherjee's Jasmine. Mukherjee replaces the point of view of the perpetrator with the first-person perspective of the anguished rape victim and refers to the assault as rape. After Mukherjee's protagonist, who I call Jay in order to acknowledge her multiple identities, loses her husband Prakash to a terrorist bomb, she leaves India to commit sati at the college in Florida where Prakash was meant to study. Using falsified documents, Jay travels to Europe and meets Half-Face, the captain of the boat that carries her to the US. Once in Florida, Half-Face offers her a ride to the nearby motel where he lives. He denies responsibility for the rape before it begins, his words signaling his intention to have sex with her regardless of her wishes. Unlocking the door to the motel room, he says, "Note, you are entering because you want to, no coercion involved." Inside the room, Jay does not respond to his caresses and tells him about her husband, eventually begging, "Please don't do anything to me." Half-Face's response is to smash her head against the television until the screen cracks, pull off her clothes, and violently rape her. Afterward, Jay walks to the bathroom and Half-Face calls after her, "Don't take all night, second time's the sweetest." In the bathroom, faced with the inevitability of another rape, Jay pulls out the small knife and considers killing herself. Instead, she slices her tongue to drip blood from her mouth, assuming the role of Kali, the Hindu goddess of destruction. Returning to the bedroom, she slits the throat of the dozing man and then stabs him to death. She leaves the motel after burning her suitcase, no longer intending to commit sati. Instead, she sheds her previous identity to create a new life in America. In subsequent chapters, Mukherjee refers to Jay's experience specifically as rape, and Jay herself spends significant emotional energy trying to put the violent experience behind her. Most critics see Mukherjee's depiction of rape as a metaphor for other concerns if they mention the assault at all. However, Mukherjee's portrayal of the rape demands both metaphorical and bodily understandings of sexual violence. The details of Jay's assault educates readers about rape and the traumatic repercussions that haunt victim survivors for years after. Foremost, Mukherjee dispels the rape myth that women should have foreseen her assault or could have prevented it. Jay's traumatic experience, in fact, begins before she enters the motel room with Half-Face, which explains why she could not stop the events, either physically by leaving the motel or verbally by insisting she did not want to have sex. Specifically, she suffers from several symptoms of post-traumatic stress that prevent her from successfully protecting herself. Herman explains this: traumatic events generally involve threats to life or bodily injury, or a close personal encounter with violence and death. These include being taken by surprise, trapped, or exposed to the point of exhaustion, In each instance, the salient characteristic of the traumatic event is its power to inspire helplessness and terror. Jay experiences traumatic violence even before Half-Face rapes her. First, she survives the bombing that kills her husband. She's also vulnerable because of the unnarrated rapes she suffers on her journey from India to America. These rapes occur when Jay is both trapped and exposed to the point of exhaustion as she travels on planes, bribes custom guards, and improvises the next steps of her route alongside other underground travelers. Jay grimly endures these traumas by turning to the idea of fate. When Prakash is killed and she survives, the voices around her say, "This is fate." And just before she enters the motel room with Half-Face, Jay thinks, what was fated to happen would happen. Fate and survival become intertwined for her. In order to live, she must be raped. In connecting sexual assault and survival, Mukherjee underscores the place of rape in the lives of disempowered women, especially those migratory women with little control over their circumstances. When Jay enters the motel room with Half-Face, she is unable to resist the impending attack physically or verbally. Her helplessness is reinforced by the violence he inflicts upon her even before the rape itself begins. When Jay mentions her husband, he grabs her head and slams it repeatedly against the screen of the television set so hard that the screen cracks. Here, Jay experiences a symptom of trauma called constriction or numbing. Herman tells us, when a person is completely powerless and any form of resistance is futile, she may go into a state of surrender. The system of self-defense shuts down entirely. The helpless person escapes from her situation, not by action in the real world, but rather by altering her state of consciousness. Half-Face drops Jay on the bed after slamming her head into the television set, but then pauses to paw through her suitcase. Jay has entered this state of surrender. She does not try to fight or escape at this point, instead numbly awaiting the further violence. Her last attempt at verbal resistance comes as Half-Face is undoing the drawstring of her pants. "Please don't do anything to me," she says. But Half-Face undresses himself in her, and Jay narrates the rape as follows. "He stared. His hands were trembling, and then he whooped, 'Oh God,' and tried to kiss me, but he was all hands and face in motion. I twisted, only delaying the inevitable, perhaps making it worse, more forced, more violent. I tried to keep my eyes on Gampati and prayed for the strength to survive long enough to kill myself." Afterward, in the shower, she thinks of suicide, for if she leaves the bathroom, Half-Face will rape her again. Yet moments later, Jay feels no longer numb into surrendering to Half-Face's violence. Instead, she experiences the traumatic symptom of reenactment, where trauma survivors repeat the traumatic situation, sometimes unconsciously, but other times with the hope of changing the outcome of the dangerous encounter. Jay has been raped many times and is about to be raped yet again. The unresolved feelings of terror and rage she has numbed herself against inspire her to slice her tongue and re-enter the bedroom with her knife in her hand. She imagines herself as the goddess Kali, who is often portrayed with blood pouring from her mouth. As Kali and as a traumatized woman who wishes to rescript the scene of her trauma, Jay approaches the bed where Half-Face lays sleeping and slits his throat. Then she stabs him to death. Jay rewrites the outcome of this specific trauma by killing her attacker, yet she also rejects the self who had lived through the trauma by destroying the vestiges of her old life. Jay's initial plan was to take her husband's suit to the school and burn it and herself. Instead, she burns a suitcase filled with mementos of her previous life. Yet the problem with the shedding of old selves for a victim of trauma is that the traumatic event may not be integrated into her normal consciousness. Most victims suffer from PTSD, including hyperarousal, a state of permanent alertness and vigilance, as if danger might return at any moment. Other symptoms the victim may suffer include unremitting anxiety, depression, and suicide attempts. Should a victim not deal with her traumatic experience, she is likely to suffer from these symptoms indefinitely. The experience of post-traumatic stress is a critical aspect of Jay's narrative, particularly for the ending. After being raped by Half-Face and subsequently discarding her identity as Jasmine, Jay acts according to her symptoms of PTSD. She cannot establish a stable identity until she deals with her experiences of trauma, and she creates new identities to evade confrontation with her traumatic past. She continues to suffer from symptoms of PTSD, such as hyperarousal. The sight of Bud's bowling shoes recalls a similar pair in Half-Face's motel room, causing her to shudder violently. In addition, it is unclear whether Jay mistakes the man in Central Park as her husband's murderer because of her trauma. Jay believes she sees Sukhwinder Singh at the precise moment that Taylor is declaring his love for her. Faced with the opportunity for happiness, Jay may be unable to accept it because of the trauma she suffers from other men. The South Asian man across the park turns into Prakash's killer, and Jay declares she must leave New York immediately, or Singh will kill Taylor and his daughter to get to her. It is more likely that Jay is unable to accept the possibility of happiness and romantic love until she has dealt with her traumatic past. As you can see, Jasmine is a rich and complex piece of rape fiction. Mukherjee's inclusion of the details of traumatic suffering in her novel educates her readers about the experience of rape and its psychological consequences. She insists that Jay's rape be viewed foremost as the violation of a woman's body, and then secondarily as a trope about post-colonial power relations or other issues. Mukherjee's insistence upon rape as the formative experience for her protagonist underscores the importance of this story to all women. Let's now turn to the long 1990s to examine the link between the genre of rape fiction and debates about the prevalence of sexual abuse that occurred in this decade. To depict contested stories of sexual assault, these novels employed the rhetorical techniques of postmodernism and writing about trauma, eschewing the linear narration of realism that imposes certain textual interpretations. Novels such as Toni Morrison's Beloved, Jane Smiley's A Thousand Acres, and Sapphire's Push demonstrate how the portrayal of rape and incest in these novels echoes the pattern of trauma experienced by their characters in their complicated narration and often lack of tidy resolution. Utilizing the critical methodologies of Kathy Carruth, Ruth Lays, and other feminist theorists, I demonstrate how closely representation is linked to the experience and memory of a sexual assault in these novels via fragmentary narration. This model of rape fiction offers a compelling explanation to readers for the varying portrayals of rape and sexual violence seen in contemporary society, countering those who dismiss charges of sexual abuse as exaggerated or untrue. I'll speak just briefly about Patricia Chao's Monkey King, since it is less often read than Kingston or Mukherjee's works. This novel employs a deft combination of narratological strategies to explore the mental breakdown of a young Chinese-American woman named Sally Wang. Responding to contemporary debates about the prevalence and veracity of child sexual abuse, the novel utilizes the slippage in narrative certainty often seen in text by incest survivors, while also representing the accusation of false memories. 27-year-old Sally enters a psychiatric hospital after she attempts suicide, and the novel's initial chapters explore Sally's fragile mental state and her gradual ability to name the cause of her breakdown: incest. When she confronts her mother and sister during a family therapy session, her mother refuses to acknowledge the incest perpetrated by her husband. Despite her family's denial, Sally moves forward in her recovery. Ultimately, her mother and sister never fully accept her accusation against her father for their own complicated reasons of guilt and complicity. Chao's depiction of familial denial and survival as resistance in this novel emphasizes the need for multiple narrative strategies to depict incest. Her portrayal of hope in the final pages as Sally moves forward with her life also offers readers a model for supporting victim survivors in their recoveries from incest. Chao utilizes the trajectory of the recovery plot to structure the novel, but she departs from that plot's typical implementation of traumatic realism in a significant way. Here, realism acts as a foil to demonstrate the incomprehensibility of trauma, rather than offering an avenue towards understanding the traumatic incursion. Specifically, Chao's meticulous documentation of Sally's struggle to perform mundane daily activities underscores the enormity of her mental distress. On her first day in the hospital, Sally cannot select a meal for herself, finding the list of choices on the cafeteria menu incomprehensible. Sally's difficulties with the seemingly simple everyday activities that Chao depicts in such careful detail works to emphasize the unreality that she experienced in living through sexual abuse. At the beginning of the novel, this unreality has been dominating her life. Sally is so tormented by traumatic memories that she hallucinates her dead father's presence and the resumption of his nighttime visits to her bed. Because these hallucinations are interspersed among the descriptions of Sally's daily routine, they adeptly illustrate the incomprehensible and commanding nature of trauma. Chao's use of realism offers the necessary contrast between reality and unreality that definitively establishes Sally's pain, while simultaneously eschewing the details that may seem gratuitous to certain readers. Sally's struggle with the hallucinations and her memories of incest is rendered vividly through flashes of bodily memory that return her to the moment of trauma. Chao evokes the stifling fear Sally lived with as a young girl in textual eruptions that are as unexpected to Sally as they are to readers. A startling trace of trauma surfaces during a visit to her mother's house when Sally sees Piggy, her childhood stuffed animal. Here's a quote. "When his beady eyes caught the light from the overhead bulb, I felt a repulsion so great, I almost dropped him," unquote. Piggy is the toy her father places in her arms after he has sex with her. Although Sally has not forgotten the abuse, recovery requires her to join these bodily memories with the facts of sexual abuse. But until Sally herself proclaims the word incest, confirming the textual implications, Chao allows these traces of trauma to simply imply what occurred. Such vivid examples of emotional distress prepare readers to accept the source of Sally's pain by underscoring the holistic experience of trauma before definitively identifying it as incest. Chao emphasizes the difficulties Sally experiences in creating a narrative about incest, even while she carefully eschews representation of specific details. To make this point, she portrays Sally narrating the experience of talking about the abuse, but not the words that describe incest until much later in the novel. So she summarizes the therapy, what happened to the therapy group rather than actually telling the details in the novel. And she focuses on the steps of Sally's recovery rather than offering readers details about the abuse itself. So Sally's narration of the abuse just fills one page in the middle of the novel, and it occurs after she's released from the psychiatric hospital. Because she's progressed with her recovery, Sally is able to relate both the traumatic events themselves and her emotions about them. The story is filled with the sensory details that haunted her earlier, with her father's hands gripping her wrists, etc. But Chao relays these specifics only after Sally has made significant progress in her recovery. So readers realize how relating the explicit details helps the survivor come to terms with and exert control over the traumatic events. The novel ends with this collective reminder that everyone, family members and the larger community, must open their eyes to the trauma and pain in front of them. Denying the existence of incest or trivializing its long-term effects allows bystanders to remain ignorant about how victim survivors suffer. But such denial harms bystanders as well by allowing sexual abusers to perpetrate their crimes with impunity, threatening the collective safety of everyone. By representing incest in the Asian American community, Monkey King breaks the silence and demands accountability for the pain wrought by perpetrators and the denial and inaction of the larger community that occurred through the end of the 20th century. I end my book with an analysis of male rape novels of the 21st century, which expand the communal understanding of rape by uncoupling gender from the victims and perpetrators. In the future, readers will undoubtedly encounter many more stories, both fictional and real, of male, female, transgender, and gender fluid victim survivors. By educating readers, shattering stereotypes, and urging empathy for victim survivors, rape novels demand an end to rape culture and a safer world for everyone. So I will end here, and I am happy to answer questions from anyone who has them.
Wow. Thank you so much, Robin. This was a really wonderful, thorough discussion of the three texts and writers within their historical context. So, floor is open for questions, and I'm sure people have a lot of questions and comments. So, we can use the chat box. You can wave in front of the camera, and I can recognize you, or you can use the raise hand function. Whatever works. And if I miss you, please just sort of call my attention. I'll be happy to recognize you. So, Maurice.
Thank you so much, Robin. That was a really interesting and illuminating talk. I'm familiar with the first two novels and not with the third one. So that I'm going to put that on my list. As you were talking, I was thinking about um, the perspective through which rape is depicted. And I was thinking about, for example, Chimamanda Adichie's novel, Half of a Yellow Sun, where the perspective you get is of the rapist
Mm-hmm.
during a war situation, but and the effect of the victim's reactions during the event and how that scars this rapist, who's
Mm-hmm.
a character that we actually are very familiar with, that we've almost grown up with within the novel, which is really disturbing, obviously. And then the second one that I was thinking about was a novel by a Maori writer in New Zealand, Once Were Warriors by Alan Duff,
Mm-hmm.
where a young child is raped, a young teenager, and the effect of that on the teenager. So I think this perspective that we are given in the depiction of this horrific assault has different impacts.
Absolutely.
And the last comment that you made about male rape in the 21st century, that took me to Michaela Cole's television series, I May Destroy You, where you
Mm-hmm.
see the impact of rape on the victim, as well as an instance of male rape, right? Along with narratives of who's to blame,
Yes.
what did you do in order. So I was wondering, I mean, it's a lot of examples that I was thinking about as I was listening to your talk, and I was wondering whether you could comment on the perspective that we get of the rape and any of the other things that I've mentioned.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks for noticing that. And the television series is on my list. I have not watched it yet, but I of course have a list that of texts that I want to pursue further. So basically, if you look at the 70s, 80s, and 90s, perspective is a really important way the rape novel evolves. So just as you were saying, that in Half of a Yellow Sun, we get the rapist perspective. This is the perspective that the rape novel is pushing back against. It's the traditional perspective in the earlier American fiction, where we are looking through the perpetrator's point of view, or the other option is the bystanders are watching, and but it isn't the victim herself. And I'm using that gendered pronoun very deliberately for the 20th century. The first rape novels were about women specifically. So in the 70s and with Kingston, you'll see this, that we're looking at the aunt, but we're not getting that first person perspective. That doesn't come until the 1980s. And so in the 70s, we have a bystander, not the rapist, offering us the story, but it's still not her perspective. And also something important to realize is that there's no good ending. Not, how could there be a good ending to a rape story? But the ending for the 70s is death, insanity, or a disappearance from the text. So we have death with No Name Woman. We have insanity with Nicola Breedlove in The Bluest Eye. In The Woman's Room by Marilyn French, we have the character who is described in such detail simply vanish by going off to a commune. And we just never hear how she lives her life later. So it's in the 80s, we get both the first person perspective of the victim. And this is why I start shifting to victim survivor, because we get the recovery story. We get the very realistic depiction from the victim survivor's perspective about the pain she has suffered. But then we also get life afterward. And so then by the 1990s, we get a societal skepticism about how can these stories be true. There's so many stories now. And so the stories were told in this new way that showed less of a chronological narration and more of a shattered understanding of the traumatic event. And that's what I was trying to show with how Patricia Chao talks about the rape of Sally by her father. So when I was writing my book, initially it was only going to go up to 2000 and it was only going to be about women. And I was going to write a short afterword about men's stories. And then the afterword turned into the longest chapter in the book. Because I realized that not only do we now have a flourishing subgenre of men's stories, but we also have an almost parallel chronology of how in America men's stories are understood. So if you think of, film is a good way for us to think of how men's stories are understood. Deliverance was a novel, it's a very maybe more famous film now, and it turned the sexual violence against Bobby into a joke. He turned feminized, he turned weak, he turned into someone who deserved it because he let it happen, which absolutely, there was no way he could avoid what happened to him. And so we have texts about men that first perpetuate these stereotypes and then start to push back and challenge them. And then by the time we get to real men telling their stories, such as Barry Lopez in his 2013 essay, Sliver of Sky from Harper's, there's already a model for men telling their stories because of women telling their stories in rape novels. And so interestingly, with women, memoirs and life writing came first, and then the fiction. The memoirs and the fiction are sort of happening simultaneously with men's stories. And so now men's stories are being told with the same kind of sympathy and empathy and understanding, yet mostly they're written by women still. There are not as many stories written by men. So I'll be very curious to see how these stories are taken further.
Thank you. Serena, you have a question in the chat box. Do you want to just read it or tell us the question? Yeah.
Hey, thanks so much for your work and sharing it with us. I have a number of questions, but I guess what I wanted to focus on was more of a pedagogy question in terms of, I'm presuming that you teach, and how do you teach this stuff? I mentioned in the chat that I'm a sociologist and anthropologist, and I carry out my research is with survivors of gender-based violence and sexual assault in post-conflict settings, and so I end up having to teach this stuff, and always am struggling with how to deal with my students that also may be survivors and taking care of them.
Absolutely, it's a really challenging question. I do think that after the Me Too movement began in 2017, there's a little bit more understanding amongst folks who are not survivors themselves that there should be an awareness and a level of compassion when talking about the subject. I think of how, 7 to 8 years ago, trigger warnings were belittled and poo-pooed as coddling students, and we shouldn't let them choose what they will and will not engage with. And now it's much more understood why on a syllabus a trigger warning should be put, why a student should be able to opt out of a classroom discussion or have another way of engaging with the subject matter. So something I do talk about in advance is the fact that there are likely survivors in everyone's lives, and we don't know necessarily who those people are. And if you don't know who they are, there is a reason for that. And you should be thinking about, why wouldn't a person today want to be public about being a survivor of sexual violence? And of course, there are so many reasons, very, very good reasons for not being public. But it also will engage the students with the idea of, it's not because it's just not happening around me. It's because maybe I have not shown myself as being open to hearing about or being sympathetic to sexual violence. And so I don't hear these stories from the people in my life. In the classroom, I don't tend to end up cold calling people ever. I have a lot of pre-writing in advance where I will ask students to answer a question or two, and I've told them I will assume that I can talk about what you've written about unless you say in your writing, please do not talk about this in class, or you can bring it up, but don't refer it back to me as the author. And so I have been able to use students' reactions sort of anonymously to talk about the material. I've also been very fortunate that there have been some men in my classes who have talked openly about their evolution of understanding of sexual violence. I remember teaching Louise Erdrich's Love Medicine, and there's a chapter where a 15-year-old girl is raped by a man, and we talked about that narration, and the young man, and he wasn't even a traditional college-age student, he was maybe 25 or 27, married with kids, and he said, I didn't even read that as rape. And we go back and we look at the scene, he's like, oh, okay, now I get it. So I think that's also really helpful for other young men and women too, to see like, oh, you don't have to already understand. You can ask questions and we can talk openly. And it's the talking and the discussion that ultimately helps us all combat sexual violence. It's the silence and the embarrassment, or the feeling, oh, I don't want to get it wrong, so I'm not going to engage. That is what keeps us from changing our culture. And so that's the one thing I think I ultimately stress the most, is we have to talk about this, because silence is why this went hidden and unpunished for so long.
Okay, so we have a question in the chat from Amritjit Singh. So Amrit, do you want to quickly share the question, or do you want me to read it? You're on mute.
Well, Robin, thank you for sharing your research. It's a very urgent, important topic, and changeable. And we have had some of this conversation before. I was just wondering that, I really latched on to your analysis of the rape scene in Jasmine. But I'm not the only one who has serious reservations about the identity politics in that novel. So I was wondering if I'm hoping that your careful analysis allows us to look at the identity politics differently. I'm not sure, for me it does, because I do feel that there's a breeziness about Bharti Mukherjee's views on assimilation and immigration, which comes out, of course, more in our essays, including the well-known one and that she published in New York Times.
Mhm.
Yeah, the book
Yeah.
review. So, I mean, is there a way to connect those two?
I think there
Uh,
is.
okay, I want to hear you.
Yes, great, thank you. It's a good question, and so I think the breeziness and the assimilationist tendencies that you're referring to um, are we can really explain back to the post-traumatic stress. So this idea that, oh, this character can shed selves and that she can suddenly become an American teenager, and then suddenly she can become a Midwestern wife who's adopting a child and going to become a mother, etc. And she basically is whoever the man in her life wants her to be. If we think about how with post-traumatic stress, a victim survivor cannot move past that trauma and really sort of start anew, really start putting down roots, etc., in the present moment. We can see why the character, she goes from Florida to New York, from Flushing to Manhattan to then Iowa. Some critics have looked at this and said, oh, it's the following of the Manifest Destiny and the American exceptionalism, and she's becoming so very American by following Huck Finn's footsteps and lighting out for the territories by the end when she's going to California. Instead, it's, the first time I talked about this at a conference, I remember someone saying, this is a really dark and sad way of looking at this novel. It's not a hopeful, invigorating way. And I said, yes, it is. So I also think that the scene in Central Park where she sees Suki, the one who planted the bomb in the sari shop that kills her husband Prakash, that was meant to kill her, and he's a Sikh fundamentalist who wants the separate state, etc. So I'll tell you a little anecdote from when I interviewed Mukherjee. I asked her about that scene, and she herself said, yes, I really meant for that to be Suki. He came to the United States, he found her, and he will kill her. And I don't think that works at all. Instead, I think the text works so much better being a symptom of post-traumatic stress, where she sees across the park a brown-skinned man who asks Taylor's daughter, is that your mummy? And thinks to herself, I can't become in a relationship with Taylor because that man is going to kill me. I will move to Iowa. And so who is that man? He's not anybody in particular. This is all about her and her problems and her need to recover. So in that, I think it takes away the breeziness. It takes away the assimilationist part and says, this is someone who is literally running away from her past because she needs to heal, and she has yet to find the healing context that will allow her to do that.
So,
may I follow up a little?
actually, Amrit, I want to, given time limitations, I want to get to a couple other questions that are in the chat, if you don't mind. Yeah. Carlene, Ruth had to leave and she had a question, but Carlene, you're on. Do you want me to read your question or do you want to articulate it?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation. I had a question about slave narratives and how they fit into your work and whether you engage with them. As you were speaking, One of the slave narratives that came to mind, of course, was Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to whether you engaged with slave narratives. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for the question. So in my chapter where I talk about textual predecessors to the rape novel, I talk about memoirs, I talk about anonymous testimonials, and then I talk about the feminist nonfiction, excuse me. And so part of what I do talk about is specifically Ida B. Wells, and I reference slave narratives as leading up to the works by the people I talk about in much greater detail. So Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. I analyze Billie Holiday's memoir as well. And so I talk about how Black women's understandings of sexual violence in real stories. So the slave narratives are the predecessors of these even more recent works by Black women, and how Black women, Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye is 1970, right? She's one of the very first rape novels to come out. And I have a little blog post about that from last October because it was the 50th anniversary of The Bluest Eye being published. So there's absolutely that history that goes back through Black women's voices. I didn't have the space in the book to talk as in depth as that topic demanded, but there absolutely is a connection.
Okay. So we have a question from Ruth, but Ruth left, but the question's interesting. She commends you for the talk. She had to go teach, and she says, I just lost, okay. I scrolled, okay, here. I wonder if you could address the change in culture that might account for changes in narrative depictions of female and male rape.
Okay, so my argument on the chapter about male rape is that basically the women paved the way for men to be able to talk about male rape in a way that demanded the same kind of sympathy and empathy. So the women were pushing back against these stereotypes about rape and the rape myths that dictated their lives throughout the 20th century, but which culminated in the anti-rape movement of the 60s and 1970s, which led to real tangible change, like laws against men being able to rape their wives. Like there was an immunity for men who raped their wives because they were their wives. They couldn't be raped, etc. Allowing one's sexual history to be put onto trial, etc., etc. So if we look at how women changed the culture when it came to understanding rape, it was fairly easy for men to use that same path and to say the kinds of stereotypes about male rape, which basically turns into emasculation and the idea that this person must be gay, right? That any man who is penetrated must be therefore a gay man, or a version of a woman, right? A feminized man. In the 1980s, I looked at The Prince of Tides and a Stephen King novella that The Shawshank Redemption was based on, etc. And there are, and these men, these male authors, talk about the physical effects of being raped as menstruation. And so the male victim turns into a menstruating woman based on his injuries. And so we're shifting out of that kind of misogyny and then shifting into talking about how it's not a man's fault or it's not a boy's fault. So we can look at The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini. We can look at Push, the author Push Sapphire writes a follow-up to Push called The Kid, and see how the boy who is abused turns into the man who becomes an abuser as well. The last book I talk about in the last chapter is written by Amber Tamblyn, who is a poet and actress and an activist. And she has written a novel called Any Man, published in 2018, that has a female rapist who is never caught, who rapes men. And so the first provocative thing, of course, is one of my male friends said to me, how is that possible? How can men be raped by a woman? And so first there's the shattering of that stereotype. And then there is the really intense look at how do we as a culture judge men who have been raped. And it's not quite as sympathetically yet, but it's getting there, definitely.
Well, we're about 11 minutes over time, and I know people have to go teach and whatnot, but there's some really good questions in the chat too about military conflict and rape and when people who don't survive. And I think you sort of answered Martha's question when you just talked a little bit about men and the rape of men and so forth.
Mhm.
So I want to take this opportunity to say thank you, Robin, for a brilliant talk. As always, I know you're brilliant, but I'm glad to have this opportunity to hear you speak and engage in this conversation. I'm very grateful to my friends and colleagues from across the globe who have joined us virtually for this session. It's been a great conversation, and I just got back a few minutes of the Sala experience in all of this. So I'm very grateful to all of you for coming, and thank you very much. Stay well, be well, take care of yourselves, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time.